this is Dr. Ulysses, and welcome back to our series on ethics. Today I will be discussing the fundamentals of ethics. And to get us started, I want to draw on this portion of Plato's Republic, typically known as the myth of Gyges or the Ring of Gyges. In that section of Plato's Republic, Plato asked, famously, why be moral? In other words, is there an incentive to being moral, or to being good, or to being a just person? The motive of that question is delineated in the Ring of Gyges. That section features famous dialogues between Socrates and Glaucon. Glaucon said that he remained unconvinced, reiterating his objection in a question, and I quote, "Do you, Socrates, want to appear to have persuaded us, or do you truly want to convince us that it is better in every way to be just than to be unjust?" End of quote. To which Socrates replied, and I quote, "I would certainly wish to convince you. Truly, I said, if I could." Glaucon rebuffed Socrates' objective, telling him dismissively, and I quote, "You are not getting your wish." Further, he questioned whether there was something such as joy, for example, which we should desire for its inherent good instead of its consequences. Socrates replied, stating that he believed there is such a thing as the pursuit of goodness for its own sake, but he also acknowledged there is room for a good which we desire both, and I quote, its own sake and for its own consequences. He identified knowledge, sight, and health as such. Glaucon agreed with Socrates on that account, but he also proposed there is a third kind of good, such as physical training, being treated when ill, the practice of medicine, and other ways of making money. Then he asked Socrates whether he agreed or not. Glaucon elaborated before Socrates could reply, saying those things are wearisome, so to speak, but beneficial to us, and adding, and I quote, "We should not want them for their own sake, but because of the rewards and other benefits which result from them." Socrates acquiesced that there is such a third kind, and also inquired about the reason why Glaucon asked that question. Glaucon appealed to justice and asked Socrates, which kind of good do you suppose that justice would fit in? Socrates replied, saying he would put justice in the category of good that is good for its sake as well as for its consequences. According to Socrates, that category is the finest of class. Glaucon disagreed and argued that justice belongs to the wearisome class, a good that is pursued, and I quote, for the rewards and popularity, which comes with a good reputation, but to be avoided in itself as being difficult. Then Glaucon proceeded to provide examples juxtaposing injustice with justice, while making the case for injustice as being more beneficial than justice. And he said, and I quote, "Suppose now there were two such magic rings." And again, this is where the concept of the Ring of Gyges come into place. "And the just put one of those magic rings, and the unjust put the other." Glaucon continued, "No man can be imagined to be of such an iron nature that he would stand fast in justice. No man would keep his hands off what was not his own, when he could safely take whatever he liked out of the market, and go into houses and lie with anyone at his pleasure, or kill or release from prison whom he would, and in all respects be like God among men. Then the actions of the just would be as the actions of the unjust, They would both come at last to the same point. And this we would truly affirm to be a great proof that a man is just, not willingly or because he thinks that justice is in any way good to him individually, but out of necessity. For wherever anyone thinks that he can safely be unjust, then there he is unjust. For all men believe in their hearts that injustice is far more profitable than the individual to the individual than justice. And he who argues, as I have been supposing, will say that they are right. And if you can imagine in anyone obtaining this power and becoming invisible and never doing anything wrong and touching what was not in others, he would be thought to be a fool by onlookers, wretched idiot. Although they would praise him in his face, but behind his back, they would think of him as being a fool. End of quote. Glaucon defended his opposition to Socrates' arguments regarding justice as one of the finest goods, or something that is worth pursuing for its own sake as well as for its own consequences. Glaucon also defended his claim that injustice is better and more profitable than justice. He continued saying that the unjust can acquire wealth with unjust means. And if we look at our society, especially in the history of crime, those who benefit from contrabands, and it is either be drug dealing or other kinds of wealth that is acquired through unjust means. So Glaucon's point here is that the unjust person can acquire wealth with unjust means, yet he or she will enjoy the benefits such as the friendship of people, including priests and prophets who like to cocoon to the rich. In addition, the unjust person could also use his or her wealth to offer sacrifices to the gods, if indeed the gods exist and care to concern themselves with the affairs of human beings and gain their favor. For instance, he listed many benefits of injustice. The unjust person can acquire wealth with unjust means, and so on and so forth. He also said, and I quote, he rules, that is the unjust person, rules his city because of his reputation for justice. He marries into any family he wants to. He gives his children in marriage to anyone he wishes to. He has contractual and other associations with anyone he may desire. And besides all these advantages, he benefits in the pursuits of gain because he does not scruple to practice injustice. In any contest, public or private, he is the winner, getting the better of his enemies and accumulating wealth. He benefits his friends and does harm to his enemies. To the gods, he offers great sacrifices and gifts which will satisfy them, and he can serve the gods even better than the just man could, and also such man as he wants, with the result that he is likely to be dearer to the gods. This, what they say, Socrates, that both from the gods and men, the unjust secures a better life than the just. We may disagree with the arguments Glaucon made in the above quote, as did Socrates. But his arguments will resonate with people who make a living out of contraband and ill-gotten gains. Glaucon essentially ridiculed the people who strive to be honest, the people who strive to be good, the people who strive to be honest and moral. His suggestion is that the honest person may enjoy the reputation and adulation of his friends, but that reputation does not buy wealth. Glaucon's brother, Adeimantus, who was apparently present during the debate, also chimed in, supporting Glaucon's arguments and providing more reasons why the life of the unjust is better, making injustice appealing, palatable, and beneficial. In fact, more so than injustice, according to Glaucon and his companions. However, while it may appear that Glaucon's made a compelling case for being unjust as opposed to being just, Socrates had the last words. And in fact, he soundly and validly argued that in every way it is better to be just than to be unjust. And he also said that the worth of being just, or the worth of being morally right or having the good character does not necessarily translate and does not always translate into material signs such as the acquisition of wealth. This brings us, folks, to full circle to the fundamental questions and concerns of moral wisdom and living. And again, let's go back to the question that Plato asked at the beginning. Why be just? Is there an incentive to being just? If we were to commit our lives to living a moral life, to developing good character, to being good to other people, would we at the end of the day benefit like in a very extrinsic way, extrinsic as opposed to intrinsic, and extrinsic values to living a moral life for many will look like the acquisition of wealth and so on and so forth. Must we have extrinsic incentives, for instance, beside a reputation of having an upstanding character? Is being just worthy of pursuit for its own sake, or must it have some external benefits that make it worthwhile? Nicholas Smith, professor at Lewis and Clark College, and Thomas Breakhouse from Lynchburg College identified several themes of morality from Plato's works, which are also connected and are reinforced in the character-based moral system that we've come to know as virtue ethics. They say, for instance, a rejection of retaliation or the return of harm for harm or evil for evil. They claim that doing injustice harms one's soul, the thing that is most precious to one, and hence it is better to suffer injustice than to do injustice to others. Some form of what is called eudaimonism, and eudaimonism is this comes from this Greek word eudaimonia, which has been normally translated as happiness or the state of being content. That is, goodness is to be understood in terms of conduciveness to human happiness, well-being, flourishing, which may also be understood as living well or doing well. Other themes that these scholars identified in Plato's works, particularly as they pertain to virtue ethics as a character-based morality system, the view that only virtue is good just by itself, anything else that is good only is good for people who use it. The view that also there is some kind of unity among all virtues. The person who is kind will often be the person who is loving, generous, and friendly. There is a unity there. And people who are just will also often be as loving, friendly, and any other characteristics, character traits that you can identify from the work of Aristotle and Plato as well. The view is that the citizen who has agreed to live in a state must always obey the state. Now that's a very important concept, and we see that manifesting in the very lives of Socrates. And those of you may be very familiar with Socrates and his story, particularly the way his life was taken away. He was accused as being against the state, and although he was in prison waiting to go through for his death punishment, and his friends were trying to release him from prison, and even then Socrates refused to break free from prison, and reiterating his commitment to respect the laws of the state. The flip side of that is, if you disagree with the laws of the state, if for some reasons you find the laws of the state are unjust, then instead of breaking them, you should persuade the state to actually change them. Thus, the moral views of Socrates and Plato are concisely summed up in the New World Encyclopedia in the following terms, and I quote, "For both Socrates and Plato, the ethical life was inextricably linked to the intellectual life, such that the unexamined life was not worth living." And such view was very consistent among the Greeks. It was not just about the instruction of moral rules, but it was about developing, cultivating a way of life that is based on reason and also reflected in a life of virtues. Lewis, likewise Aristotle, took a similar approach to answering the question of how we ought to live in the same manner, but concluded that developing character traits through reason or intellectual virtue should become the foundation of living a moral life. Others, such as St. Aquinas and St. Augustine, linked morality or morality systems to the sovereign will of God and salvific law. And as we will see later in our coverage of natural law from a Christian perspective, both St. Augustine and St. Aquinas argued that ultimately the individual will be able to live a moral life once his or her will is aligned with God's will or is linked to God's salvific love. There were other philosophers who took on the questions of morality. Kant, for instance, linked morality to practical reason. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill linked morality to utility and happiness. We will take a look at these philosophical traditions as well. There are other prominent philosophers from the east end of the spectrum who also took on the questions of morality and argued and presented arguments for ethical living based on other principles. Confucius and Lao Tzu and Gautama approached the question of how we ought to live in a slightly different way. For instance, Confucius drew our attention to traditions and family and argued that a morality system revolved around Ren, which means benevolence. Lao Tzu drew our attention to Tao and nature as the basis for morality, and Gautama posited mental and meditative discipline as the basis for living a moral life. And ultimately that path, according to the Buddha, lead to nirvana, that is to say the same, the enlightenment. Now, to present time, we have Peter Singer, an Australian moral philosopher and professor of bioethics at Princeton University, wrote several works, and many of which are very important, but one of his most influential books is Practical Ethics. In it, Singer draws our attention not just to the importance of the moral traditions in philosophy, but also to the most pressing contemporary moral issues, such as equality and discrimination on the grounds of race, sex, sexual orientations, and gender, abortion, the use of embryos for research, euthanasia, political violence, and so the list goes. The preservation of our planets, which is typically conceptualized in environmental ethics. As stated in the introduction segment of this series on ethics, I will examine not just traditions in moral philosophies, but also various moral issues, including those just identified by Peter Singer. Thank you. Stay tuned for more segments from this series on ethics.